Hey guys, it's Miss Sinclair for AP World History Modern. If you are one of my students, you should be watching this on Edpuzzle so you can answer the questions as we go. Please remember that you are to complete a daily cover page in conjunction with every lecture. And I expect that you are taking notes on your own for your own use and studying. So if you don't have something to take notes with, I would recommend it. Please feel free to pause the video at any time to get something down. And I always recommend that you watch the videos that I reference in here. They are often fun or interesting, and they're always designed to enrich the lecture. There's so much more to history than I can cover. So today we are going to be learning about ancient Iran, so Persia, and we'll start talking about ancient Greece. We'll continue talking about Greece and then Rome. Remember, all of these Unit 0 topics will not be on the AP test, but they are important for your general understanding as a historian. So let's get started. So for your Bellwork for today, I would like you to think about the different religions and belief systems that we have already learned about. What is similar and what is different between them? So you are going to complete the Bellwork section of your daily cover page answering this question. Today, we're going to be learning about ancient Iran, aka Persia, and ancient Greece. You will be able to compare and contrast Persia and Greece. So, let's get started. Remember, we are talking about the classical era, this time before the Common Era, so BCE, before the Common Era. And if you're looking at a timeline, as you move forward in history in this BCE era, you are going down in numbers, right? So we're looking at the years 1000 to 30 BCE. Let's start with Persia. So Persia makes up the territory that we now consider to be Iran. That's why you might hear people from Iran referring to themselves as Persians, not Arab, right? Ethnically, they're Persian. So geographically, we see that Persia is going to be building off the heritage started in Mesopotamia. It's going to take advantage of all the mineral deposits located there. Copper, tin, gold, silver. And so in particular, what's going to be useful for Persia is going to be iron, right? So we are now in the Iron Age instead of the Bronze Age. This territory is relatively isolated. It's surrounded by mountains, the Zagros Mountains, the Caucasus Mountains. You have the Caspian Sea, the Persian Gulf, and then more mountains and desert. Northeastern Persia is less protected and thus more vulnerable to attack from nomads in Central Asia. So, in general, we find that the climate is very inhospitable unless you have created irrigation systems. In particular, we find that the Persian Empire is going to create underground irrigation systems for agriculture. So let's start by talking about the rise of Persia. Oops, I apologize for that. So we are going to see it all starts with Cyrus. Cyrus is going to be the founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. He is going to found Media, Lydia, and Babylon. So remember all of those sort of Mesopotamian city-states that we have talked about in the past. Cyrus is going to unite various Persian tribes. He's going to overthrow the Median monarch and help found the Persian Empire. So, what does Persian society look like? Well, it's very patriarchal. We see that males are the head of households, that they have absolute authority over all their family members. This is pretty similar to what we've already learned about with China, as well as other Near Eastern cultures like Israel. We see that the society is divided into 3 classes predominantly. You have warriors, priests, and peasants, with the warriors being really the most dominant group. The priests are going to be referred to as magi, M-A-G-I, and they're going to really supervise the sacrifices necessary in religion. And peasants were predominantly farmers and shepherds. So, Darius the First is going to be the son of Cyrus, and he's going to be really important. He is going to seize the throne in 522 BCE. He will expand the empire towards India, Europe, and Africa, and is called the second founder of the Persian Empire because he's going to create a new organizational structure within it. So, under Darius, you can see the size of Persia. The capital is going to be located in Susa. You can see located there. And how this territory is enormous. I mean, it's larger than any country in the region now. And it is a major world power. So, how did they organize things? Well, you are going to see that they divided the empire into 20 provinces. These provinces are going to be ruled by a satrap, a governor. And these governors are often related by marriage to the royal family. So every province is like a miniature royal court. The role of satrap is a hereditary role, so families really get to know their area well, right? This position is inherited from father to son. The further you were from the center of Persia, the more independence you had. You were able to really govern as you wished. And we see that some of the duties entrusted to satraps include collecting taxes to send to the king. The king would set the rate of taxation for each individual province. And eventually, the tax burden became too much for the provinces. This is in part because of corruption at different levels of the government. So, since provinces couldn't meet their tax obligation, it would eventually lead to an economic downturn. One of the key things about Persia is going to be their road structure. So infrastructure is really key. You have these well-maintained and patrolled royal roads, which means you can move within the empire without worrying about being robbed, without worrying that the currency was going to change. And this is going to allow for the diffusion of ideas, of language. It's going to allow for economic prosperity and the spread of innovation. So let's talk about the royal court a little bit. In ancient Persia, the king would have multiple wives. And these women often served as political pawns through marriage, right? So women didn't necessarily have a lot of agency. And yet, we see that sort of behind the scenes, women played a really important role. They could be very politically influential. They could own property. They were able to travel. The court would travel throughout the empire with the different seasons. So you weren't in one place all the time. It's not like everyone was in Washington, D.C. Imagine if the president and Congress, traveled to different capital cities in the United States every month, right? So every month they're like up, moving somewhere new. And it was the job of that state and that city to provide for the president and everyone in Congress. They had to provide housing, food, entertainment, security, right? So it's a very expensive burden, but it's a way to also keep your more far-flung provinces from getting too wealthy and thus considering independence. It's a way to stay connected to the people in a vast empire, and a way to really see your kingdom. So who was in the court? Well, the king and his family, but also various aristocrats, administrators, bodyguards, slaves, servants. It was all very fancy. So the Persian kings developed a style of kingship in which they were held sort of aloof and majestic. They were the masters of all. So how does that work? If you have a huge kingdom, you have lots of people, how do you actually govern it all? Well, we see that they have a very complex bureaucratic system in place. You had workers whose job it was to oversee construction projects, maintain irrigation, farm. These workers were divided into men, women, and children. Women would usually get less food than the men unless they were pregnant or they were breastfeeding, in which case they would get a little bit more food. And often these workers were slaves from captured territories. So remember how we talked about with Israel, how you had these exiles, the Babylonian exile, right? How there was a forced migration after Israel and Judah were conquered by the Babylonians. Same kind of idea. As the Persians would conquer places, they would take some of the people with them back home to work on various projects. The capital was Susa, but the ceremonial capital was Persepolis. Persepolis is a really important and beautiful archaeological site that's in danger from ISIS and different extremist groups. We see that lots of religious ceremonies would happen more at Persepolis, whereas Susa was more practical. So let's talk a little bit about religion. Let's discuss this first. So I want you to compare and contrast Persia with some of our earlier Mesopotamian societies. So if you are one of my students, you're going to be responding to this question on Edpuzzle. What are some similarities and differences? Compare and contrast is another one of our historical thinking skills that the AP wants us to be familiar with. So it's one that you should be able to pull out. Okay. Persian religion. It's going to be Zoroastrianism. Technically, it's still around today, not very widely practiced, but it's going to be influential for our other monotheistic religions. So it begins in Iran, and it's centered around a single benevolent deity, a god. You guys ready for this pronunciation? Ahurmazada. Aced it. Who was engaged with a struggle with the demonic forces. So one of the ideas here about Zoroastrianism that sets it apart from some of our other early religions is that you have an all-powerful good and sort of an all-powerful evil, and these two forces are constantly struggling with each other, right? It's not just you have some gods, and sometimes the gods do good things, and sometimes the gods do bad things, right? In ancient cultures, you didn't necessarily have an evil god and a good god, right? There's no like Satan and God. They're fallible. They sometimes do good things, they sometimes do bad things. Or Zoroastrianism, we see the emergence of this good versus evil sort of conflict that pervades the world. And Zoroastrianism believes that ultimately good will win and restore the world. So it really emphasizes truth-telling, purity, and reverence for nature. It's going to definitely influence Judaism, especially with the idea of like God and the devil, heaven and hell, reward and punishment. and it is going to be the major religion of the Persian Empire. The origins are kind of unclear. We don't exactly know where it starts. And it is going to combine some philosophical ideas with other religious traditions. So this wasn't solely like a monotheistic religion, like there were other gods and powers that you would acknowledge as well, but it fits into this greater schema of good versus evil. Okay, now, in the West, we're going to have the Greeks. I really, really, really recommend that you watch this one. You know, there's some of these videos that I say like, you can watch it if you want. It's fun. This one's an important one. It gives you a really good overview of the relationship between Persians and Greeks. But before we move on to the Greeks, let's talk a practice question. Which is not a method by which the Persians strengthened their empire? So you're going to be answering this in Edpuzzle, and so I'm not going to go over the answer with you here, but think about which is not one of the ways that the Persians strengthened their empire. Now, as we start talking about ancient Greece, we know a lot about ancient Greece. It's if people talk about a classical education, they're talking about the Greeks and the Romans, right? It has an enormous influence on sort of our Western culture. You guys are probably already familiar with some mythology, with some architecture forms, some art, some poetry, some people, places even. So what do you already know about ancient Greece? I want you to list as many things as you can. Resist the urge to Google search. It's okay if you don't know a lot, but you're going to be answering this as a discussion question in Edpuzzle. Ancient Greece. I was able to visit the Acropolis and the Parthenon a few years ago. I went with Travel Club, and it was really cool. It was my first time to Greece. And I was geeking out over everything a little bit. So, as we often start with our early civilizations, geography. So, we see lots of civilizations arise around the Aegean Sea. First of all, guys, this is world history. You still need to know your geography. It's kind of important. So, the Aegean Sea is going to be on the eastern side of Greece. The Ionian Sea, right, is right here, close to the western side of Greece, and the Adriatic is like over here, right? So there are lots of civilizations that are going to emerge. You have like the Minoans on Crete. The Phoenicians are all up through here that we're not going to talk about. There's lots of cool stuff. You could spend tons of time on this. But we are limited. So let's get to it. So we see that civilization arises around the Aegean. Most of southern Greece is really dry and rocky. It's not good for farming. Pretty good for goats, though. But since they depend on navigable rivers and rainfall for rain, they will be able to grow things that rely on little rain. Think olives, think grapes, sheep, goats. So no real metal or timber reserves, but lots of marble, lots of stone, lots of clay. We see lots of natural harbors, right? There's hundreds of tiny Greek islands. And Greece is part of the Mediterranean ecological zone. So remember last year in human geography how we learned about Mediterranean-style architecture? Well, that's because there's a very specific ecosystem around the Mediterranean. So we see that all the lands sort of around the Mediterranean have the same sort of climate. It's really going to allow for migration and the transfer of crops, technology, and trade. So Greek cultural area includes the Greek mainland, but it's also going to include all the islands and these parts of Asia Minor, aka the Anatolian Peninsula. So, the emergence of the polis. Polis simply means city-state. So we're going back to city-states with ancient Greece like we had with Mesopotamia. So there's the beginning of Greek history starts with the Archaic period. Sorry, that should say 800 to 480 BCE. The Archaic period is going to reveal new knowledge, the Phoenician alphabet, which is the first true alphabet. We see that you have a population explosion, which is going to lead to the growth of urban centers. So we have more intensive land use, more people, urban centers, right? Same pattern that we've seen before. So in a city-state, in these different polis, right? The Acropolis is at the center of the city. Annapolis, Indianapolis, right? These are cities. So at the center of every city, you're going to have the Acropolis. It simply is the center, right? And the city will spread out around the Acropolis. Near the Acropolis will be the Agora, which is going to be the open space. Government buildings, marketplaces are going to be located here. These are constants throughout different Greek cities. Even if when you say, oh, I went to the Acropolis, most people think specifically of Athens. We see that people lived in the city, and then farmers around the city will be under their protection, and the cultural influence of that city. There's going to be a single government of the polis. So one of the things that will emerge is that Athens, Sparta, some of these different city-states have different government systems, and they are often in competition with each other. So what are some of these cities? Well, I've mentioned a couple of them already. You got Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Megara, Agros, Olympia, Thebes. So at the height of the classical Greek era, we're going to have over 200 different city-states. What about when they go to war, right? Conflict. Well, the hoplites, you can see this gentleman here. The hoplites are going to be the soldiers and the military strategy that they use. So it's a close formation of heavily armored infantry. You got helmet, breastplate, leg guards, and a shield. So like you hold your shield so it half covers you and half covers the guy next to you. And you're all standing really close together, so you're kind of like a turtle. You fight in close contact and with cooperation. So you make sort of like a solid wall of shield. Most of the soldiers are farmer citizens, right? You're not a professional soldier. They say, oh no, we're being attacked. Tell your neighbors, grab your armor. You don't have special training. Most fights are short. They're like a mere set of hours, not weeks. They're not campaigns. And since soldiers are farmers, most of the fighting takes place between agricultural cycles, right? The time when everyone's not working on the farm. All right, what about the colonies? Well, I said already that Greek islands, the Greek mainland, not great for agricultural production. So we see that the population will surpass the carrying capacity of the land. So what they're going to do is set up colonies in the Mediterranean, on different islands, and along the Black Sea. So that coastline up along Asia Minor, the Anatolian Peninsula. Some people went to these colonies willingly. Some did not, right? It's a punishment. But it's going to lead to the spread of Greek culture around the entire region. Colonization will introduce the Greeks to new ideas, but it will also sharpen their identity as they identify, okay, this is who we are versus them. Colonial interactions with non-Greeks will prompt them to think of themselves as a coherent group, the Hellenes, right? Think Hellenes, the Hellenes, as contrasted with the Barbari, right? The barbarians. The Greeks were the Hellenes, like the Hellenistic age, versus the barbarians, people who are not like us, uncivilized. We also see the emergence of coins. That's pretty neat. All right, so we also see some new trends in intellectual and government systems. So these trends include things, trying to get my notes to stand up. Are going to include things like literature. So you got Homer writing the Odyssey and the Iliad, these epic poems. You're going to have dramas written, plays, think like Eurydice, Oedipus. You're going to have Herodotus, who's going to be our first historian. He's going to write an account of the Peloponnesian War, the wars between Athens and Sparta. It's also a great example of how biased history can be. You also are going to have the emergence of different philosophical systems. We'll talk more about that a little bit later, but let's talk about governments. So like I said, the different city-states had different government systems. So in the beginning, you had monarchs, right? I'm the king, blah, blah, blah. These monarchs are going to lose favor, right? So monarchs are really in more of the Mycenaean period. Then you're going to have the emergence of tyrants. So these tyrants are going to be like dictators, right? Monarchs who aren't listening to people very well. Then you're also going to have oligarchs. Oligarchs are a group of people, like a small council of people who are in charge. Then you're going to have democracies, right? Like Athens, where everyone can vote. So democracy is all about power to the people. It's actually power to some citizens. Only men could be citizens, and you had to be free, and most people were not technically a citizen. But all citizens administered the workings of the government. The citizens made up about 10 to 20% of Athens' population. It was free adult men. The height of Athenian democracy is going to be reached under Pericles, who is going to rule from 443 to 429 BCE. These dates are not important for you to remember. But it's going to lead to a golden age of Athens. So we're going to talk a lot more about like the height of Athenian power with our next lecture. Places like Sparta are going to be ruled by oligarchs, where rule of the few. The government is ruled by a small group of wealthy citizens. And social mobility would allow people to join the oligarchy. This is a good one. It talks about ancient Greece, its development, and unique features. So, discussion question. What are the characteristic features of the urban center of the Greek polis? So what do we expect to find in a Greek city? And how did both the oligarchy and democratic systems develop from rejection of tyranny, right? So tyranny is going to be like a king gone bad. The oligarchs and the democratic systems are rejections of those bad kings. We haven't talked about this specifically, so I want you to think critically. How would these two systems emerge from rejection of tyranny? Okay. Last thing we are going to talk about today is going to be the Persian Wars. There's a neat little picture here. Look, they're fighting. Cool. So, we first see the Persian War in the 5th century BCE. And it's going to be sort of this constant conflict between the Greek city-states and the Persian Empire. Cyrus will conquer Lydia, and some city-states will rebel. It's going to lead to the Ionian Revolt. Then Darius will send soldiers to attack Eretria and Athens because they supported the rebels. Athens manages to hold out. They're not conquered. Then Xerxes, Darius' son, decides to attack with a huge army. So they send a message to every city demanding earth and water as tokens of submission. And many cities agree. I mean, they can't hold out against the vast Persian army. You saw how big the map was, right? They covered such a large territory. They're so much wealthier than any single city-state. But some cities will unite under Sparta's leadership to fight back. So at the Battle of Thermopylae, the Battle of 300, some of you have seen the movie, 300 Spartans and their king, Leonidas, will die holding back the Persian army so their allies can't escape. Athens gets sacked. And the Persians think they have some advantages and make mistakes. So, I mean, the Battle of 300 is very exciting, but it's a failure, right? Everyone dies. Athens, though, despite being sacked and attacked, manages to hold out. In part, it's because of where Athens is located and their large port. So they're surrounded by water on 3 sides. So they just have to defend from land on one side, and they can continue to get supplies from sea. So they have half a fleet left of their navy, and they fight back. They take a new leadership role in the Delian League, and over 20 years, push the Persians out of Greece. It's sort of hard to see here. I don't know why my background disappeared, but the Battle of 300. I recommend you watch it. It's a really goofy movie. It is not historically accurate at all, but there's a great scene where the messenger shows up and is like, "Give us earth and water." And they're like, "This is Sparta," and like kicks the guy. Like, it's very dramatic. The link to the video is on our YouTube playlist. So if you want a fun video to watch, it's a good one. But with that, that's the conclusion of our lecture for today. So I would like you, in your daily cover page, to compare and contrast Persia and Greece.